Good evening, and welcome to the pre-committee conference call for the college football playoff rankings. Today is November 26th, 2024, 6:31 Eastern Time. The rankings are going to be released in about an hour and a half. This is for week 14. We're going to talk about a few key points that I want to touch on heading into the rankings, and then we can also recap the rankings and the reaction immediately after. But I think these rankings are important. I think for two reasons. One is they're important on positioning heading into rivalry weekend. And we're going to talk about how positioning both heading into the night, and then also coming out of the night and into the last round or the last weekend of regular season games sets up for the final rankings, which would come next Sunday. Um, and then also what we're looking for in these rankings, and how the committee's viewing a lot of the action that happened over the weekend. So starting on the weekend's action, just talking about what is the positioning heading into the night. So before week 13, which was this past weekend, you had Oregon as at one, Texas at two, Miami at three, and Boise State at four. Now those are the four highest ranked conference champions. Of course, those are not where those some of those teams were ranked. And then five was Ohio State, six was Penn State, seven Indiana, and then Notre Dame at eight, Alabama at nine, Ole Miss at 10, Georgia at 11, and BYU at 12. I would suggest just looking at a playoff bracket for the Week 13 rankings because, as I mentioned, those rankings are not consistent with the playoff rankings are not consistent with where what the bracket would shape out to be because of the conference championship automatic qualifiers. But I think the three points to look at in terms of recapping last week is one, what happened with Indiana. That's they lost to Ohio State, which I think heading into the weekend, the key question was focused on Indiana and how far would they fall if they lost to Ohio State, and whether it was by a score or whether it was by three or four touchdowns. And there was going to be a focus on how they played. And the other two were a little bit more surprising, one more surprising than the other. So you had Ole Miss losing to Florida at Florida by a touchdown, 24-17. Um, Ole Miss coming off a bye week after beating Georgia in that 28-10 game 2 weeks ago. Went to Florida, and Florida has been not they're not Kansas hot in terms of a team, but they've performed relatively well over the last couple weeks. Upset LSU 2 weeks ago, and then this past week upset Ole Miss. And then I think the big stunner late Saturday night was Alabama going out to Oklahoma, the 7:30 night game, and just laying a complete egg against an Oklahoma team that has had their struggles throughout the year. So I think the question is how far are all these teams going to fall? You would have said Indiana was in a really precarious spot around 3:30 p.m. Eastern time on Saturday, losing to Ohio State by more than three touchdowns. But then you have what happened to Ole Miss, and then you have Alabama. And I think the focus now turns to how far does Ole Miss and Alabama fall? Now, you know, I think the AP poll is somewhat instructive on this. Now, I've long had problems with the AP poll, but and the way it's kind of put together. But if you look at the AP poll, you have Alabama at 13 in the latest in the Week 14 AP poll. And then you have almost at 15 in between them is Arizona State. You do have Clemson above Alabama, which I want to get to when we talk about what we're looking for tonight. But you know that would imply Alabama falling about six spots from their Week 13 ranking, and then Ole Miss falling, I believe that's seven spots, excuse me, six spots from their Week 13 ranking. Now, there is an interesting debate about what loss was worse for Alabama and Ole Miss, and then how do you compare the two resumes? And if we have time at the end, we'll get to that. But you know, just heading into tonight, I think positioning is super important to look at. The last 10 years, when we had a 14 playoff, the penultimate rankings, so the ones that would come next week right before the conference championships, those are the ones that everyone focused on because you didn't have certainty of what conference champion would get into the playoff and who wouldn't. We saw last year a great example of this with FSU being number four, I believe, heading into the playoff, or excuse me, heading into the conference championship weekend. They might have been number three actually, but they were firmly in undefeated. They end up winning their conference championship, but the SEC with Alabama winning, ended up bumping Florida State out and getting into the playoffs. So that conversation, I think, with the 12-team playoff has now pulled forward the importance of the rankings to the last weekend of the regular season. Because at this point, we know the conference champion is going to get into the playoff. We know Oregon and Ohio State are both going to get into the playoff, regardless of how whoever wins that Big Ten championship. Now, I'd assume Ohio State beats Michigan this weekend, but we feel pretty good about Penn State making the playoff regardless. We feel pretty good about Notre Dame making the playoff if they win this weekend. So the key question uh, is now around week 14, and how can teams that are on the fringe kind of position themselves? How does someone like a Clemson position themselves if they go and beat South Carolina, and then they're off next week for conference championship? So this is really the last day, I think, on Saturday to really, and I guess this week will be Thursday through Saturday, to really demonstrate that you're a team that should be in. Now, uh, what am I watching for? I think there are a couple things I'm looking for to really understand how is the committee thinking about things. So the first is is the committee going to evaluate these teams? There's been a lot of talk over the last 10 years of is it based on resume? Is it, the best team, the best 12 teams in the country? Is it a body of work question? And I think the one that's also been interesting recently, and I think people have used it specifically with Georgia, is do you rank the team based on how they are at their best? So for Georgia, that Tennessee game, or do you take a cross section of the entire season? Um, because you can't really assume that team is going to be at their best in every single playoff game. So I mentioned Georgia. Georgia's a good barometer. This is a team that played at Kentucky and nearly lost the game. They went out to Alabama earlier in the year and got down 28-0 in the first half. Ended up coming back and having a lead late in the game and ultimately losing that game by a touchdown to Alabama. This is a team that in a huge game against Ole Miss went out and lost by more than two scores. But then the following week comes back in a must-win game against Tennessee and plays like the Georgia that we know, that we've known about the last 3 years. So, you know, is Georgia looked at as someone that, and I should also mention the Texas game too, where Georgia came out and really dominated Texas. So, is the committee going to look at Georgia and say, okay, at their best, they are a top, you know, three team in the country? Or are they going to say, Georgia, if you take the average of Georgia's performance, they're probably more in that 3 to 5 spot. And I think that's going to be an interesting. Um, I think it's going to tell us a lot about how the committee is ranking these teams, which is important as we head to the last few rankings, and you start to think about that last at-large spot. Who gets in? Is it a three-loss Alabama? Is it two-loss Clemson? There's been some talk about South Carolina somehow sneaking in. So I think the Georgia would be a good barometer to look at tonight to see, does the committee rank them based on their total work during the season, or are they ranking them based on their max potential that they've exhibited in some of these games throughout the year? The the second, I think, question that's going to be huge, especially for these at-large teams, is how is the committee going to evaluate losses? So I think there's a couple questions within that to ask. One is how do you lose? Who do you lose to? And within how do you lose? Is it a one play type loss? Is it losing by three touchdowns? What was the time of day? What was the manner in which you lose? Was it on the road? On the road night games are an a completely different animal. I think also within that, the question I think especially when you compare across teams is how do you win as well? So one that comes to mind here is if you think about like a Miami or a BYU, teams that for all intents and purposes probably lost an extra game on their schedule. BYU, I'm thinking about that Utah game. Miami, I'm thinking about Virginia Tech, and then also the Cal game. But because of some questionable officiating towards the end, and I think you could even, if you wanted to, start talking about conspiracy theories with the conference stepping in. you know, how does the committee think about those effective losses in those games relative to just say a two or three loss team? So, I think those will be questions that will have to be thought through. You know, it's not just with the two and three loss teams. I think you're going to see it with some of these one loss teams that are crowding around the 4 or 5 spot. So take Texas, for example. Texas really hasn't played they played, of course, an SEC schedule, but at the same time, they haven't really played and beat a top team. Now they're going to play Texas A&M, who in the AP poll this week was ranked in the top 25. So um, they will have a chance to get a top 25 win. Now they also, when you look at the metrics on Texas, still a decent strength of schedule. Um, Strength of record is pretty high right now. It's at believe it's at 5. And then their game control, which is another metric that the committee likes to look at, is number 3. So, on a quantitative standpoint, they have good metrics. I think the key drawback that people are going to say about Texas is, they're 10-1. Their one loss was to Georgia. And I think what's interesting is, not only did they lose to Georgia at home, um, but it was a game where they really didn't do very well. Um, and Georgia, the last week or two, has been constrained by the teams ahead of them that have beat them. So you had Ole Miss, you had Alabama, yeah, and then you had Tennessee who had they beaten, and there was a kind of a big log jam in that 7 to 11 area where you had those 4 two-loss SEC teams. Now, Ole Miss and Alabama lose, they get their third loss. Georgia, that 10-2 record looks a lot better now, assuming they win this weekend. So you're going to have Georgia with 2 losses, 3-2 against top 25 teams, number one strength of schedule. And I think because of the Alabama and Ole Miss losses, it's going to free them now to be compared to Texas head to head. It's going to free them to be compared to Penn State head to head, maybe even in Notre Dame. Um, and I think when you do that, they actually stack up pretty well, right? They beat Texas um, in at Texas night game, and they beat him by 15. Now, I think the game was probably closer than the score indicates, but and I think it'd be interesting to see Texas rematch them in the SEC championship game. But I think for right now, you could say Georgia probably should be ahead of Texas, and they'll be compared. I hope they're compared into that in that group. And then when you compare Georgia to Penn State. I think both from a resume standpoint, but also team at their best. Georgia compares favorably to Penn State. So does Georgia slingshot up in the rankings? They were ranked at 10 coming into the rankings tonight. Could they go to a 5 or 4 spot? I think it's certainly possible. Um, I'd be a little surprised if the committee put them above Notre Dame. I think if you rank them purely based on, the team at their best, they should be ahead of Notre Dame. But, Notre Dame is a team that has, since that NIU loss, really dominated every team that they've played. They've been putting up a ton of points. They have a couple ranked wins, including the Texas A&M win to start the year on the road, night game at Texas A&M. So I think the committee's probably going to leave Notre Dame ahead of Georgia, but and also kind of point to the one loss compared to the Georgia second loss. But I mean, Georgia's a team that could really be their ceiling right now is probably number 3 behind Oregon and Ohio State, and expecting to be in that 3 to 6-ish range. Tennessee is, of course, another team that it's been much talked about has really benefited from the events over the weekend. They're a team that was on the bubble heading into last week, but yeah, is going to probably be rising up in the rankings. Now, does Tennessee go above Indiana? That's, I think, an interesting question. Tennessee's 2 losses would have been to an Arkansas team that was a little bit of a, I think when you lose once to one of these teams, you can call it more fluky. So they lose to Arkansas, and then they also lose to Georgia. Now they have a win against Alabama. Alabama, of course, is going to be a little bit lower in the rankings, so it's going to look less impressive, but still a strong win that they made at home. Is Tennessee going to be above Indiana? How does the committee think about that one? I think that'll be interesting because this Indiana loss, again, the score is going to say that Indiana got blown out. And I think also the yardage will show that. I think Indiana had 151 or 152 offensive yards in the game, and something like 70 or so came on that first drive. But I mean, Indiana was tied 7-7 deep into the second quarter with Ohio State, and then they have the fumbled punt, which I think is more of a one-time adjustment that you would expect the team not to make in the future. And then you have the fumble punt that leads to a touchdown, and then you have the punt return touchdown from Caleb Downs to start the second half. And right away they're down 21-7. So yeah, you can make the argument that Indiana really hung in there against Ohio State, and at a minimum, you know, I think Penn State will be ranked above Indiana, but these two teams are somewhat similar in the sense that they really haven't played anyone besides Ohio State. Penn State with I guess a closer loss to Ohio State than Indiana, which probably will lead the committee to put them above Indiana. But so I think the net of what I'm saying is that you're going to get a little bit of a sense of how the committee is evaluating losses. Um, I think that the next theme is, and this speaks to positioning, is where are these ACC teams? Now, Miami heading into the weekend was at number 8, and then you had, let's just check this. So you had Miami at number 8, then you had SMU at 13, and Clemson at 17. Now, these are the college football playoff rankings. Now, if you go to the AP poll for week 14, you have Miami at 8, SMU at 9, and then Clemson at 12. Again, the reason this is important is because there is a view out there that if you lose in your conference championship game, you should not be penalized for losing in terms of the ranking. So if just say Miami and SMU are both in the ACC championship, the team that loses, people think should not be it should not be affected. It should not affect their college football playoff ranking. Um, and I think it's an interesting argument. I think it's going to be applied inconsistently, based on how the committee, basically what teams the committee wants to put in. But you could end up in a situation where both SMU and Miami are now ranked in the top 11 or 12 of the college football playoff rankings, which basically I think would solidify the ACC getting two teams in. Now, again, this assumes both Miami and SMU end up winning this weekend. But yeah, you could be in a situation where both teams in the ACC championship are in a good spot to get into the playoff. And yeah, I think that brings up a question of the team that loses in the ACC championship that's going to get the at-large bid. How does that team stack up to an Alabama or an Ole Miss? Because let's say it's Clemson so Miami loses to Syracuse, and then it's Clemson SMU in the ACC championship, and then SMU wins. So SMU's in automatic qualifier. Clemson now is a three-loss team. But that third loss came in the ACC championship. I'm assuming Clemson is going to be. Well, this will be an interesting question. Where's Clemson relative to Alabama and Ole Miss? Because Clemson in the AP poll right now is ranked 12. Alabama's ranked 13. Now, if you just compared these teams, Clemson, Alabama, and Ole Miss, Alabama and Ole Miss both have 3 losses. Clemson has 2 losses. Clemson has the 57th strength of schedule in the country. Alabama at 11, Ole Miss at 27. Um, and then if you think about common opponents, the one that pops out is Georgia. Clemson lost 34-3 to start the year. Alabama beat Georgia by 7. Ole Miss beat Georgia by 18. And if you go to the other common opponent, and the only ranked win that Clemson would have on their schedule would be South Carolina. Again, assuming they win this weekend, they would have beaten South Carolina. Ole Miss would have beaten South Carolina 27-3, and Alabama would have beaten them 27-25. So there really is nothing differentiating Clemson versus Ole Miss and Alabama. The question I think is, does the committee look at how the team is playing recently, um, and how what does that indicate for them that team being able to contend for a national championship? Because Clemson wins these last two games of the year for relative to Alabama and Ole Miss. Does the committee look at that and say, okay, Clemson beat South Carolina, it's more recent, whereas Alabama went to Oklahoma and lost 24-3. I think we'll get a really good sense this weekend of how the committee views that question. And because I think if you're in a situation where Clemson's above Alabama in the ranking, and whether that's at like 12 or whether that's at and whatever it is, say both teams win, you're gonna I can't imagine the committee knocking Clemson down below Alabama when both teams win, especially Clemson beating a ranked team, Alabama beating Auburn. Even if Alabama just say beat Auburn by 30 and Clemson beat South Carolina by a touchdown, I think that the committee's going to have a tough time putting Alabama ahead of Clemson if they already have Clemson ahead of Alabama coming into these rankings. So that's something that I'm kind of paying attention to because the again the positioning of the three ACC teams, SMU, Miami, and Clemson, is going to be instructive for whether Alabama and Ole Miss can potentially sneak back in to an at-large spot. And then I think last point I'm looking at, and this is a team that's in a solid spot regardless, but where is Notre Dame going to be? Because they were number six heading into the rankings. Now Indiana lost, so they're going to at least jump to five. Penn State's at four, Texas at three. Now I mentioned before, Georgia might now be could be jumping up into this three or four spot ahead of Texas. Now that now you can do a comparison of Texas and Georgia a little bit more easily. But let's just say that Georgia is behind these teams. So you have Notre Dame at least going to five. Now I think it's an interesting question. What team should be higher, Notre Dame or Penn State? And I think the reason this is important, at least in my eyes, is if you just took the rankings today, right? You you have um, you have Notre Dame right now in the eighth seed, again ranked sixth. They heading into the night. So if they won their first round game, they'd have to go play the number one team in the country. Now it's going to be Oregon or Ohio State most likely. That's a tough road. Now convert like if you compare that to say um, being the sixth ranked team in the country where Penn State is. Again, Penn State's ranked number four right now, but there would be the sixth seed in the playoff. That team is going to play the 11 seed, assuming they beat the 11 seed, which that could be Indiana, um, that could be Indiana, that could be the ACC at large team, or it could be one of those SEC teams Alabama or Ole Miss that I mentioned could sneak in. But that number six seed, you win that game. Now you're playing the three seed, who will probably be the ACC champion. Again, a lot easier of a path to get to the semifinals. Playing someone like Miami versus playing the Big Ten champion. So um, that is, I think Notre Dame's going to have an argument to be. They're definitely going to be at five. And the question is, should they really actually be at four above Penn State? Penn State having, they do have one ranked win on their schedule because Illinois now is in the college football playoff top 25 rankings. So that actually benefits them, amusingly. But, um, they have a ranked win against Texas A&M in a hostile environment. It's a team that's dominated every other game they've played again, besides that NIU loss. Now, the loss to NIU is a lot worse than Penn State's Ohio State loss. But is the committee just going to look at it and say, okay, what team is playing better today? And what team do we think has a better chance of winning the national championship? I think we should be paying attention to where Penn State and Notre Dame are seated relative to each other. Um, I think that I'm going down my list. That's kind of all I wanted to preview heading into the rankings. I think we'll learn a lot coming coming out of the rankings. And again, the point I really just want to emphasize here is unlike previous years when you had a 14 playoff and you had the teams that were competing to get into the 14 playoff, all were playing on championship weekend, um, and they were all able to kind of give one last uh, exhibition to the committee to try to earn their way into the playoff. It's a little bit different this time around. A lot of those teams, especially in the 6 to 12 range, just say they are gonna their last game is actually gonna be this weekend, because they won't be playing in the conference championship game. So their last test is really and chance to show the committee the strength of their team is this weekend. And I think because of that, you are now pulling forward the importance of the penultimate rankings, which would be next week, and that was over the last 10 years of the 14 playoffs. You're pulling that forward to this week, because teams can really lock up playoff spots at the end, or in this week's game. So I think a lot to pay attention to tonight. I'll be back on the line to recap it after, and look forward to talking to you guys then.